In the late summer of 480 BCE, heavy gray smoke from the burning temples of the Acropolis drifted across the Saronic Gulf, casting a dark shadow over the cornered Greek fleet. This was the Battle of Salamis, the precise geographical choke point where the survival of a fractured Hellenic alliance rested on the wooden decks of just 370 triremes. Pinned against the island of Salamis, the Greeks faced the undisputed naval might of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, an armada of over 600 galleys riding the momentum of their recent victory at Thermopylae. It was a strategic nightmare, as the Persians possessed total numerical superiority and the resources of a continent. Yet, in one of military history's greatest tactical paradoxes, the massive scale of the Persian fleet was about to be weaponized against itself. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Yes, in this episode, we break down the calculated disinformation, the punishing coastal terrain, and the lethal bronze-beaked ramming tactics that transformed a narrow mile-wide strait into a graveyard for an imperial invasion. The Greek commanders had temporarily delayed total annihilation in the aftermath of the 300, but the alliance was cracking under the pressure of a burned capital and a displaced population. To actually win the war and prevent the subjugation of the Greek mainland, they needed King Xerxes to make one catastrophic command error, and they were going to lay the perfect trap to ensure he did. The fall of the Spartan king Leonidas at the pass of Thermopylae in August 480 BCE is often remembered as a glorious last stand, but in strict military terms, it was a profound strategic defeat. And the collapse of the land defense meant the Greek naval contingent at Artemisium, having just fought the Persian fleet to a brutal stalemate, had no choice but to execute a rapid tactical withdrawal southward. Central Greece was suddenly torn open. The region of Boeotia submitted to the Achaemenid Empire, and the overland route to Attica lay completely unguarded. The Hellenic League was forced into a desperate scramble to preserve its remaining military assets before the Persian juggernaut could advance. Facing an unstoppable land invasion, the Athenian assembly made the agonizing pragmatic calculation to abandon their ancestral homeland entirely. In a massive logistical undertaking, the civilian population of the city-state was evacuated across the water to the islands of Salamis and Aegina, as well as to the Peloponnesian city of Troezen. Only a handful of temple guards and desperate citizens remained behind to barricade the Acropolis. Within days, the Persian vanguard arrived. King Xerxes breached the wooden defenses, ordered the execution of the holdouts, and put the ancient sanctuaries to the torch. From the crowded shores of Salamis, the evacuated Athenians and the allied commanders watched the flames of the Acropolis burn against the night sky, a stark, devastating reminder of the cost of their military collapse. This immense psychological pressure threatened to shatter the fragile Greek coalition. The Peloponnesian city-states viewed the defense of central Greece as a lost cause and strictly prioritized their own geographic survival. Their supreme strategy was purely terrestrial: withdraw the remaining infantry to the Peloponnese and build a massive fortified wall across the Isthmus of Corinth. For the Athenian commander Themistocles, this plan was a strategic death sentence, knowing a wall would be useless if the Persian Navy could simply sail around it and land troops in the Peloponnesian rear. Yet, fear is a powerful political solvent. With Athens reduced to ash, the Peloponnesian commanders demanded a full retreat to the Isthmus of Corinth, a move that would permanently fracture the alliance and hand Xerxes undisputed control of the sea. To prevent this withdrawal, the Hellenic League relied on a strained, deeply divided command structure. Nominally, the supreme admiral of the fleet was Ariabignes of Sparta, on a political appointment made strictly to appease the Peloponnesian factions, who categorically refused to serve under Athenian leadership. In reality, the strategic architect of the Greek naval defense was Themistocles of Athens. Years earlier, exercising profound military foresight, Themistocles had convinced the Athenian assembly to invest a massive windfall of silver from the Laurian mines not into public wealth distributions, but into constructing a state-of-the-art navy. Themistocles was a pragmatic political survivor, forced to maneuver through hostile councils, democratic debates, and shifting loyalties to keep the fleet intact. Across the water, King Xerxes faced no such political friction. He commanded an absolute centralized autocracy where a single decree mobilized the military and financial resources of 3 continents. All of this vast political asymmetry was perfectly mirrored in their naval technology. The Greek trireme was a specialized heavy weapon of war. Driven by 170 rowers operating in a blind synchronized rhythm beneath the decks, the trireme functioned less as a troop transport and more as a guided maritime missile. Its primary tactical objective was to smash its heavy bronze-sheathed beak directly into enemy timber at maximum velocity. Conversely, the Persian Armada, spearheaded by elite Phoenician and Ionian squadrons, relied on a fundamentally different military doctrine. Their galleys were built taller, lighter, and more maneuverable. The Persian tactical approach was to utilize superior speed to envelop the enemy, rain down suppression fire from their elevated decks, and deploy heavily armed marines to board and physically capture opposing vessels. In a direct clash of resources, the Persian force of between 600 and 800 ships thoroughly dwarfed the allied Greek contingent of roughly 370 triremes. The stark collision of these 2 naval doctrines dictated the strict parameters of Greek survival. If the Hellenic fleet attempted to fight in the wide expanses of the Aegean Sea, or if they retreated to the open waters off the Isthmus of Corinth, as Ariabignes demanded, their destruction was mathematically inevitable. The Persian admirals would expertly utilize their vast numerical advantage to widen their lines and completely envelop the smaller Greek formation. In open water, the lighter, faster Persian ships would easily outflank the heavy Greek triremes, which is exactly why Themistocles knew he had to force the battle in a cage. The debate among the Hellenic commanders had degraded from strategic disagreement into outright mutiny. Recognizing that the Peloponnesian admirals were hours away from dissolving the fleet and setting sail for the isthmus, Themistocles abandoned the council and executed a profound act of psychological warfare. Under the cover of a moonless night, he dispatched his most trusted servant, a tutor named Sisinus, across the waters of the Saronic Gulf, directly into the sprawling Persian encampment at Phaleron. Sisinus carried a fabricated message of ultimate betrayal, claiming that Themistocles had secretly shifted his allegiance to the great king. The disinformation was engineered to be devastatingly plausible. The Greek alliance was entirely fractured, as the commanders were consumed by panic, and they were preparing to quietly flee the straits before dawn. If the Imperial Armada struck immediately, Sisinus promised, they would effortlessly crush the disorganized Hellenic Navy as it tried to escape, securing a decisive victory without a protracted siege. This maneuver stands as a masterclass in military intelligence because the lie was constructed almost entirely from the truth. Xerxes possessed extensive spy networks that consistently and accurately reported the bitter infighting, regional tribalism, and shifting loyalties plaguing the Greek city-states. The fabricated defection of a pragmatic Athenian commander perfectly validated the Persian emperor's existing biases regarding Hellenic instability. From his royal pavilion, Xerxes did not see a calculated ambush. He saw the inevitable, a logical collapse of an inferior political system. Dismissing the inherent tactical risks of a night operation in unfamiliar waters, the Persian High Command swallowed the bait whole and issued the fatal order to intercept the retreat. The entire Imperial Armada was mobilized, tasked with an immediate and complex maritime blockade to cut off all avenues of Greek escape. Taking the bait, Xerxes ordered his admirals to push the massive fleet forward into the darkness, explicitly sealing off the narrow exits of the straits to catch the fleeing Greeks. But he had no idea he was locking the door from the inside. To seal off the Greek escape, the Persian High Command divided their massive armada, is deploying a formidable Egyptian squadron to block the western exit near Megara, while the main Phoenician and Ionian fleets pushed into the eastern channels. This was a monumental logistical undertaking conducted entirely under the cover of darkness. The geography of the Saronic Gulf forced hundreds of towering warships to navigate narrow, treacherous waters without the aid of moonlight, requiring absolute discipline to avoid catastrophic collisions. For the rowers trapped below decks, there was no respite. Maintaining a combat-ready formation against the shifting coastal currents meant continuous grueling physical exertion throughout the night. Their only reality was the rhythmic, exhausting grind of tens of thousands of heavy wooden oars slicing through the dark water, hour after relentless hour. By forcing this nocturnal mobilization, the Persian admirals unknowingly traded their most vital asset, the physiological stamina of their crews, for a blockade against an enemy that had no intention of leaving. While the Imperial fleet burned through its operational energy reserves, the Hellenic crews remained resting on the beaches of Salamis. Themistocles had calculated this physiological asymmetry perfectly, ensuring his men stayed ashore for as long as possible, conserving their muscular strength for the brutal kinetic demands of close-quarters ramming. The grim reality of the Persian maneuver was definitively confirmed in the pre-dawn hours by Aristides, an exiled Athenian statesman who perilously slipped through the tightening imperial blockade. Arriving at the tense Hellenic command tent, though Aristides delivered the decisive intelligence, the Persian fleet had fully enveloped the island. The Greek commanders, who just hours prior had been deadlocked in bitter partisan shouting matches over a retreat to the isthmus, were now presented with an inescapable, fatalistic geographic reality. The political debate was instantly terminated. Completely surrounded by an armada of over 600 ships, the alliance realized the only path of survival was to drive their bronze beaks directly through the vanguard of the great king. As the morning sun rose over the rocky peaks of Mount Aigaleo, the Persian rowers were physically depleted, holding their oars with muscle-fatigued arms. Yet they fully expected to find a disorganized, terrified enemy in full retreat. Instead, as the dawn light finally breached the narrow straits, the exhausted imperial crews heard the terrifying synchronized sound of the Greek battle paean echoing aggressively across the water. Rather than charging immediately into the overwhelming numerical superiority of the imperial vanguard, the Hellenic fleet executed a highly disciplined, synchronized maneuver known as backing water. Rowing in reverse without turning their prows, they slowly drew the Persian lines deeper into the most restricted section of the straits. This was the ultimate tactical exploitation of geographic space. In the open Aegean Sea, a fleet of over 600 vessels represents an unstoppable envelopment force capable of defeating any opposition through sheer scale. But when forced into a coastal channel barely a mile wide, a physical space that could only accommodate approximately 100 ships abreast, and the mathematical advantage of the Imperial Armada instantly collapsed. The remaining 500 Persian vessels were no longer strategic assets. They were transformed by the terrain into floating obstacles, completely incapable of deploying their lines, outflanking the enemy, or supporting the vanguard. The great king's massive navy had been effectively compressed into a dense, unmaneuverable blockade of its own making. Just as the Persian formations compressed into this bottleneck, the environment delivered a second devastating blow. A predictable morning sea breeze funneled sharply through the Saronic Gulf, generating a heavy turbulent coastal swell. The Greek triremes, deliberately constructed to be low and heavy, absorbed the shifting water with lethal stability. Conversely, the Phoenician and Ionian galleys, designed with significantly taller top decks to accommodate large contingents of archers and boarding marines, caught the sudden wind. This fatally destabilized their center of gravity, causing the ships to pitch and exposing the highly vulnerable lower planks of their hulls to the Greek lines. Recognizing this momentary structural weakness, an Athenian trireme commanded by Amenias of Pallene abruptly terminated the feigned retreat. Accelerating rapidly across the water, his crew drove their massive bronze-sheathed ram directly into the side of a leading Phoenician ship. This singular kinetic impact triggered a rapid systemic collapse of the Persian front line. Naval warfare in this period was strictly governed by the brutal physics of mass and momentum. As the entire Hellenic line surged forward at ramming speed, the heavy bronze beaks of the triremes systematically breached the compromised wooden hulls of the imperial galleys. The targeted strikes instantly snapped the long oars of the Persian rowers, fractured structural keels, and caused lower decks to flood catastrophically. The overarching tactical doctrine of the Greek commanders was perfectly realized. They circumvented a battle of infantry boarding and instead orchestrated a calculated structural demolition of the enemy fleet. With their vanguard suddenly shattered and rapidly taking on water, the surviving commanders of the leading Persian ships attempted a desperate maneuver to back water and retreat, only to crash directly into their own massive second line pushing forward. As the imperial vanguard crumpled in on itself, the systemic failure was instantly compounded by a catastrophic loss of leadership. Ariabignes, the supreme Persian admiral and brother to King Xerxes, was killed in the brutal opening exchanges while attempting to rally the Phoenician right wing. In the naval warfare of 480 BCE, where tactical coordination relied entirely on hoisted visual flags and the physical presence of the lead ship, the sudden death of the theater commander was terminal. Without centralized orders radiating from a flagship, the massive Persian formation completely disintegrated. The Armada ceased to function as a unified military instrument. Hundreds of imperial galleys were abruptly fighting blind, reduced to isolated, panicked struggles for survival. Terrified helmsmen violently entangled their oars with adjacent friendly vessels, snapping the long wooden blades. And this rendered the ships completely dead in the water and created a sprawling artificial reef of disabled hulls that blocked any coherent avenue of retreat. This collapse of operational discipline bred ruthless incidents of friendly fire as captains prioritized their own survival. The most infamous tactical evasion was executed by Artemisia of Halicarnassus, a Carian queen commanding an imperial squadron who found her galley aggressively pursued by an Athenian trireme. With her escape route choked by the density of the fleet, Artemisia made a cold calculation. She ordered her helmsman to ram directly into a friendly Calindian ship. The allied vessel sank instantly with all hands, deceiving the Athenian captain into believing Artemisia was a Greek defector, allowing her to slip away. Concurrently, the paralyzed Persian ships that could not escape were systematically boarded. Hellenic triremes carried specialized contingents of heavily armored hoplites. Once the bronze beaks locked the vessels together, these Greek heavy infantrymen deployed their disciplined tactics across the wooden decks. They methodically cleared the imperial ships, easily overpowering the lighter armored Persian marines who lacked the bronze cuirasses to survive the kinetic shock of close quarters combat. High above the slaughter, seated on a golden throne placed upon the rocky slopes of Mount Aigaleo, King Xerxes observed the absolute dismantling of his maritime logistics. He had demanded this vantage point, expecting to witness the final crushing blow against the Hellenic resistance. Instead, Xerxes watched the pride of his empire tear itself apart, and realizing with sudden clarity that the sea had just trapped his massive army on foreign soil. the sheer scale of the disaster became apparent as splintered timber and the imperial vanguard washed onto the shores of Attica. The Persian Empire had lost between 200 and 300 ships in the straits, while the Hellenic League sacrificed roughly 40 triremes. However, the true catastrophe for the Achaemenid High Command was not the localized destruction of military assets. It was the total severing of their strategic lifeline. In the warfare of antiquity, a massive land invasion force simply cannot survive in hostile territory without a secure, high-capacity seaborne supply chain. The rocky soil of central Greece could not yield enough grain to feed the occupiers. The Greek victory at Salamis had definitively broken this logistical backbone, instantly transforming a methodical campaign of conquest into a looming crisis of starvation. Compounding this logistical nightmare was a paralyzing shift in the psychology of the supreme commander. Xerxes was consumed by the vulnerability of his own geographic position. His overland retreat route relied entirely on the pontoon bridges spanning the Hellespont. If the victorious Hellenic fleet sailed north and burned those bridges, the great king and his imperial administration would be trapped on a hostile continent. Prioritizing the survival of the throne over the subjugation of the Peloponnese, Xerxes issued the order for a rapid withdrawal. He gathered the bulk of his demoralized forces and marched north toward the crossing back to Anatolia, abandoning the ruined capital of Athens. Yet, this royal retreat did not eradicate the imperial threat. Recognizing that maintaining a massive occupational footprint was no longer viable, Xerxes decoupled a highly capable fraction of his military machine. He left behind his most experienced commander, General Mardonius, transferring to him a streamlined force of regular troops and formidable heavy cavalry. Tasked with wintering in the submitted territory of Thessaly, their objective was to resume the offensive in the spring. The Persian fleet was broken, but Mardonius and an elite army of tens of thousands remained in Greece, ensuring the war was not yet over. That elite Persian land force would indeed mount a devastating campaign the following spring, but the strategic rot had already set in. Without the logistical supremacy previously guaranteed by the imperial Armada, Mardonius and his troops were ultimately isolated from their continental supply lines. In 479 BCE, the unified Hellenic infantry finally met the Persian army on the plains of Plataea. Stripped of maritime support and facing a fully mobilized Spartan-led phalanx, the Achaemenid forces were decisively defeated, permanently ending the great king's ambitions on the European continent. Salamis was the geopolitical fulcrum that made the victory at Plataea militarily possible. In the wake of this survival, the power dynamics of the ancient world irrevocably shifted. Themistocles' defining strategic doctrine, that true security and dominance lay in naval supremacy, became the bedrock of a new reality. Athens leveraged the prestige of its victory in the Straits to construct the Delian League, rapidly transforming a defensive maritime alliance into an undisputed Athenian empire. The vast wealth flowing through these newly secured Aegean sea lanes financed the monumental reconstruction of the Acropolis and underwrote the profound cultural explosion of the 5th century BCE. The philosophy of Socrates, the tragedies of Aeschylus, and the foundations of Western democratic and architectural thought were all incubated in a city that had been preserved from total erasure by the splintered timbers of the Saronic Gulf. The Battle of Salamis remains a definitive masterclass in utilizing confined geography and calculated intelligence to dismantle a numerically superior foe, ensuring that the political trajectory of the West would not be extinguished in its infancy. To continue exploring the decisive command decisions that forged our world, can subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.